Hello and welcome to another episode of the Real World Nutrition Podcast. This is episode 254, Food Expiration Dates, what they really mean, and when food is still safe. Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real World Nutrition. I'm Shelly Rael, registered dietitian nutritionist. And today I want to talk about something that seems pretty simple but really causes a lot of confusion. And that's the date on your food package. Best by, sell by, use by, expiration date. What do all these actually mean? And maybe more importantly, when you can safely eat something past that date on the package. And this is a topic I talk about a lot because food date labels are one of those things that can lead to perfectly usable food being thrown away. And at the same time, I don't want anyone listening to think, oh, great, Shelly said I can eat this because it's past the expiration date, it's still okay. So that's not what I'm saying. I do want to address food safety here, but the trick here is understanding the difference between quality and safety, knowing how food has been stored, and recognizing when something really does need to go in the trash. And if you want all the specific details and storage guidelines, I've got a link in the show notes to the blog that goes with that. So let's talk about those dates. First, they are not truly expiration dates. And this is probably the biggest thing I want you to take away from today's episode. Most dates printed on food packages are not true expiration dates. And even though I use that in the title, it is not a true definition there, expiration date. So in the United States, federal law does not generally require manufacturers to put quality-based date labels on packaged foods. Infant formula is the major exception, I should say. Its use by date is federally required. So infant formula is one that has a true expiration date, and manufacturer guarantees the nutrient content and quality through that date. Infant formula should never be used past the date that's stamped on it. Now, for most other foods, the date is generally about quality. So that means the manufacturer is telling you something about when the food is expected to have its best flavor, texture, freshness, or overall quality. But that doesn't mean that anything past that date, that food is unsafe. And this is where a lot of food gets wasted. And the Food and Drug Administration notes confusion about food date labeling accounts for an estimated 20% of consumer food waste. So that means food has been thrown away based on those dates on packages when it's still perfectly safe. So I want to break down these different definitions. So best by is one of the more common labels, best by or best if used by. And that's generally about quality. So this is things like cereals, crackers, canned goods, dry pasta, rice, and other pantry staples. And if the package is unopened and has been stored properly, the food may still be safe after that date. It's probably likely safe after that date. But the quality may not be what it once was. So maybe the crackers aren't as crisp or the cereal is a little stale. The flavor might have changed a little bit or the texture might not be quite right. But that doesn't mean it's unsafe. It just simply means it may no longer taste as good or have the same texture as it did originally. And here's another thing that I think is worth asking, and I say this a lot. If you've got food that's going past those dates, think about this. Are you actually going to use this? Because sometimes we hold on to food, some of these packaged foods or other foods, for years because technically it's still usable. And I've done this myself. In the past, I've bought evaporated milk. I use evaporated milk almost exclusively in December for holiday baking. I used what I needed. And then the next year, I still had a can from the prior year. But that can of canned milk, that evaporated milk, when I opened it a year later after I'd purchased it, when I opened it, it was like clumpy. And the date, I didn't really pay attention to the date. That wasn't the reason I threw it away. I threw it away because of the condition. It didn't have the right texture. Something was off. And it was something that I learned moving forward, that next time I don't need to buy extra cans of evaporated milk for the next holiday season. It's always available and I'll just buy it next time. But I was really surprised that it was already clumpy like that. And it was probably safe, but of course I chose not to use it. So that was just a lesson learned there. Now, the other date on here is the sell-by date. And this is primarily a retailer guideline. So it helps the store know how long to display a product for sale. And this is not telling you, the consumer, throw this away tomorrow. So you'll commonly see the sell-by dates on things like milk, eggs, and some fresh foods. And eggs are a great example. According to the USDA, eggs can generally be refrigerated 3 to 5 weeks from the day they're placed in the refrigerator. The sell-by date may pass during that period, during that 3 to 5 weeks, and the eggs can still be safe to use when they're properly handled and refrigerated. So with that means storage matters. Eggs should be refrigerated promptly, kept at 40 degrees Fahrenheit or below, and stored in their carton in the coldest part of the refrigerator rather than the door. So if someone sees a date on an egg carton and immediately throws the eggs away the next day, they may be throwing away food that is perfectly usable. But this is also where I want to put in a little caution. The date isn't the only thing that matters. How the food was handled matters too. So if those eggs were left on the counter for several hours, that may be the quality doesn't last as long. And then the use by date. This one can be a little bit more confusing because use by can mean different things depending on the product and the manufacturer. For most foods, these labels are still generally related to quality rather than a federally defined safety deadline. Infant formulas is the important exception. That's one I mentioned already. But for foods that aren't infant formulas, don't assume that use by automatically means the food is now dangerous the following day. Instead, consider the type of food, how it's been stored, how long it has been open, and whether there are signs of spoilage. And this brings us to something really important. The date isn't the only clock. So once you open a package, that printed date becomes much less useful as your only guide. Why? Because opening the food exposes it to air, handling, utensils, potentially microorganisms. And now you're dealing with another clock. How long has it been opened? How has it been stored? Was it refrigerated promptly? Was it kept cold enough? Has it been sitting on the counter? And these questions may tell you much more about food safety than the date printed on the package. So for example, refrigerated leftovers should generally be used within 3 to 4 days, 4 days max. And that's true even if the original ingredient package has a date that's still weeks away. So if you cook chicken on Sunday, you don't look at the date on the original package and decide that cooked chicken is still good for another 2 weeks. The food is now in a different state. It's changed. It's been cooked. It's been handled. It's been cooled. It's been stored. So that storage time is where the countdown is. So what about milk, yogurt, cheese, and other refrigerated foods? So we keep these things in the refrigerator. How long are they good even after they've been opened? So people want a specific answer. How many days is milk good after you open it? How long can you keep yogurt? What about cheese? And unfortunately, this isn't one where there's a universal number for every food in every refrigerator. So the storage temperature matters, handling matters, the type of food matters, and the date on the package matters differently depending on what you're looking at. So a refrigerator should be kept at 40 degrees Fahrenheit or below. And foods that are highly perishable, I would be much more conservative than I would be with a box of dry pasta. So like I can store a box of dry pasta even open for several months, different from highly perishable foods. So that's common sense food safety. Fresh meat and seafood need more attention too. So let's say you buy fresh chicken and the sell-by date is tomorrow. Now you don't necessarily have to cook it tomorrow. You do have options. So you can cook it within the recommended refrigerated storage period, so that couple days, or you can freeze it if you aren't going to use it. So freezing is one of the easiest ways to prevent food waste. And honestly, I wish more people use their freezer for as a food preservation tool rather than as a place to where food goes and gets forgotten. So when it talks about these fresh meats and seafoods, seafood is generally more perishable and should be used quickly. I tend to say if you're buying fresh seafood, you want to use that within 24 hours. So again, the date on the package, is only one piece of information, but the storage temperature and time matter. Years ago, I bought scallops intending to use them and it went a couple days. Couple days was too long. So lesson learned there, that was a huge waste of money. All right, then let's talk about another thing when it comes along, when we talk about food safety and storage times, the mold. So I know this is something that many of us have done I should say many of us. I remember this happening in childhood. You open the container of food, there's a little bit of mold, and you think, I'll just cut that part off. So I'm thinking like blocks of cheese. Oh, just cut the mold out. No, that's not really how it should go. So for things like you have leftovers, you have soft, high moisture foods, mold can extend below the visible surface. So simply cutting out or removing mold doesn't mean you're necessarily removing the contamination. So I tell people, if you see mold, there is invisible mold that's much deeper or part of that food. So don't risk it. Don't risk eating moldy food. So this is where one of those situations where I just tell people, I would rather you let that food go. If it's got mold, visible mold, it's really risky. And especially if we're talking about feeding children, older adults, pregnant people, or people with weakened immune system, this is not the time to take any chances. Food safety is not the place for the 5-second rule mentality. So, may have heard this term, I do use this term a lot, is when in doubt, throw it out. So what does that mean? And it can be frustrating because, boy, I do hate food waste. I hate throwing things away. And that's, again, I don't want people to throw things away just because of a date on the package. So I want you to think about this. If you generally cannot determine when a food had been handled safely or whether it had been handled safely, or you believe it could be spoiled or contaminated, don't risk it. Don't risk it. So some foods can be perfectly safe after their printed date, but other foods become unsafe even before that date if they haven't been stored properly. And that's an important distinction here. The printed date cannot undo poor food handling. So a distinction here is like, say you buy a container of milk and the date is still a ways off, but you accidentally leave it in the warm car for 30 minutes or maybe longer. The longer that milk was kept outside of a refrigerated or appropriate temperature, the faster it's going to spoil. So that's where I'm talking about the printed date cannot undo poor food handling. So what can you do to make food last longer? Well, there are a few very simple things that can make a big difference. First, keep your refrigerator cold enough. So aim for 40 degrees Fahrenheit or below. Second, refrigerate perishable food promptly. So the FDA recommends refrigerating leftovers and other perishables within 2 hours or within 1 hour if that temperature is above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So if it's super hot, let it cool down and then put it in the refrigerator. But don't leave it out for more than an hour. I generally set my timer for 15 minutes before if something's hot and I want to put it in the fridge so I can remember to put it in time. Third, freeze food before you lose track of it. If you bought a package of chicken and realize you're not going to cook it this week, put it in the freezer. So I buy larger containers of chicken, raw chicken, and then I divided it up into my zip top bags and put it in the freezer. If you've made too much soup, freeze some. I have a seasonal stew soup that I make around the holidays. That stuff lasted a while. So it was 5 servings. I put it in 5 different freezer bags, or I should say 4 different freezer bags, and had it over the next several months. All right, if you have bread you're not going to use, freeze it. Yes, you can freeze bread. I do it all the time, and no, it doesn't change the quality. It doesn't go stale faster. Your freezer can save you a lot of money and prevent a lot of food waste. And then finally, one of these tips, it sounds obvious, but I just find a lot of people don't do this. Label your leftovers. I have a dry erase marker that I use. I write on my containers so I can put the date so I know when we ate it, when I made it, and when it needs to go if it's not eaten by then. So you don't have to have this complicated organizational system. Just write the date on the container. And that way you don't have to stand in front of your fridge and 3 days later going, wait, what day did I make this? Did I make this Monday or was that Sunday? And then one more thing I want to mention about food waste is sometimes food is probably still safe, and that doesn't mean you have to eat it. So this is an important thing I mentioned. I touched on it earlier. I have found things in my pantry that were technically still usable, but had been sitting there for years. Like non-fat dry milk. I bought it years ago and I ended up using 1 tablespoon or something like that for a recipe. And I kept it whenever I do my annual clean out. I kept it. And this year I was like, you know what? I've not used it at all. Even though it's still safe, I've not used it at all. So I'm not going to keep it. So that's what I just say. If you've got something, ask yourself if you're actually going to use it, regardless of what the date is. It may still be safe, but if the answer is no, sometimes throwing away is simply a reminder to stop buying food based on the fantasy version of my future cooking habits. I just wish some of these things you can buy in single serves, but they don't come that way. So these are just things, if you're going to buy an obscure ingredient, just be aware that you may have that ingredient in your pantry for a while. So that's just a lesson to say, what is it you're going to realistically use? All right, so I want to come back to the beginning here. The original question, when is food actually expired? For most foods, the date on the package isn't a true expiration date. Best by is generally about quality. Sell by is primarily a retail guideline. Use by can indicate quality, although there's exceptions, and the meaning depends on the product. And then infant formula is the major federally regulated exception and should not be used after the use by date, ever. Once a food is opened, pay much more attention to how long it has been open and how it has been stored. For refrigerated leftovers, think 3 to 4 days. Keep your refrigerator at 40 degrees Fahrenheit or below. Freeze foods you aren't going to use in time. And pay attention to signs of spoilage. But don't assume the date printed on the package is a magical switch that turns a safe food into an unsafe food at the stroke of midnight. All right, so let's get some key takeaways here. Food date labels are confusing, and they shouldn't be. But until the labeling becomes more standardized, and there are some of us working behind the scenes try to get it like this, we do want to learn what those dates actually mean. And understanding the differences between quality and safety can help you reduce food waste without taking unnecessary risk. So I think that's that balance there. We don't need to throw away perfectly usable food simply because the date has passed, but we also don't need to take chances with food that has been poorly stored, shows signs of spoilage, or has been sitting around for longer than recommended. So the next time you open your fridge and see something that's past its date, don't automatically throw it away. Stop, look at what the date actually says, think about how the food has been stored, think about how long it's been open, look for signs of spoilage, and then make an informed decision. If you're still not sure, that's when I would say, when in doubt, throw it out. And again, if you want more specific guidance, I have a lot more details. Check out the blog I've linked in the show notes. And that includes additional food storage guidelines, an example of common foods. I also have additional links to some of the USDA information about storage times and food safety. All right. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Real World Nutrition. As always, I just say, if you find this helpful, share it with somebody who really is a diehard about those expiration dates or those so-called expiration dates. And if you have a food date label that's been sitting in your pantry that you never quite understood, trust me, you're not alone. But hopefully this has cleared up some of the confusion there. All right, everyone, you take care. And until next time, bye for now.